I don't think there are fixed ratios that for schools, and that's what I love about this outcome-based approach is that it really gives local control to determine these things.
But I think people will still feel comfortable figuring out what inputs add up to the output, which, how much of that is teacher cost, how much of it is admin, how much of it is building maintenance and everything that equals what we've shown to be the number.
Okay. I and to that end, I remember, 70% of every school budgets is personnel.
People.
Oh. It's personnel.
Yeah. Hey, gang. How we doing? We're at 3:00. Good timing.
We have a few more folks. Well, that's right. We've lost our House of Representatives folks, haven't we?
We have. They have a meeting that they needed to attend.
Yep.
So, why don't I call this meeting to order of the Adequacy and Distribution Work Group of the School Funding Commission. And we are meeting remotely. And we'll do our customary check-in with each other as to where we are and if anyone else is present. I'm Jay Kahn, I'm in Keene, and my wife is elsewhere in the house. Moving to my right and across, down, Val.
Yeah, Val Zanchuk's here in his office in Jaffrey by himself.
And Jane.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jane Bergeron. I'm here at home at our house in Waterville Valley with my dog Otis.
Barbara.
Hi, Barbara Tremblay here in Keene. My husband's in the other room. Good to see you all.
Likewise. Hi. Iris.
Hi, Iris Esbrook, home in Barrington. Husband may reappear.
In that sense, he'd be after this meeting. No, I know it happens. Bill Ardinger.
Hello, everybody. Bill Ardinger in Concord, New Hampshire at my law office, and I'm by myself.
All right, Bill. So Bruce and Jordan, our Carsey staff.
Yeah, Jordan Hensley here in Dover. My fiance is also present.
And Bruce Mallory in Kittery Point, Maine, at my home office, all alone.
We have minutes from our last meeting, and if folks are comfortable, I'd take a motion to approve those so that they're out on the website with our approval.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Barbara. All in favor, say aye.
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 I guess can we do that? We're all in favor.
I have a feeling that if we all just make a motion like that, you'll get away with it. We'll have Jordan. I'll teach Jordan how to write minutes correctly after the fact.
Yeah. A little less transcription. I also think that technically there's not a quorum, so you don't have to officially approve minutes for work groups.
Whoa.
There's not a quorum of the commission. That is correct. And thank you for pointing that out. All right, but we'll recommend those as approved. So in keeping with our desire that we'll work on those things that we need to today and leave to smaller groups the specific workings that we've got to do over the next 10 days. But we've got two documents that Bruce had shared with us previously. One that we haven't gone over is our the final report. And I guess as we do that, we need to look at our work groups, Bruce, because I think in the final report, the adequacy chapter, we ought to look at our, do you have that document to put up?
Yep.
Well, but also the one that, all right, we can look at this for a
Are
second.
you talking about the questions, Jay?
No, I'm looking at this, so why don't we just run through the report just so that we get a sense of it. The study of adequacy and our need to go through and talk about so that's an interesting question about the base adequacy in our efforts to define both differentiated aid and categorical aid and run through that as work groups. I think we maybe we don't have, we should talk about the base adequacy number just a bit. So if folks have this document and we've got some sense of how this, how our work is going to fit in. So
Yep.
why don't we then, if you can bring up the whole, the members here. Thank you, man, you guys are good. like the production room. So when we talk about adequacy, my sense is that what we have is the AIR report telling us that in an outcome-based model, the average cost per student is $17,000. And that that number will vary by student, by district, based on student needs and demographics of the district. And then we, anyway, given that, are there other perspectives that folks have around how we talk about adequacy?
Well, I guess, just from my perspective, we know what the cost is, but we haven't yet necessarily equated that to adequacy. At least in my mind, we haven't. We're saying, well, this is what the base amount is to get the average output. But within that, there are certainly expenses that people could argue don't constitute part of adequacy, as we've previously, defined it in existing legislation. So I guess, and I know we brought this up at the last meeting, if one school is sending all their teams to away games and paying for those buses, and that bus cost is in that total cost, is that, part of adequacy, or is that just part of a local town's desire to enrich their basic needs with some sort of extra expense, like traveling to away games or putting in tennis courts or swimming pools? And it seems to me that all of those expenses are in that cost formula. And then the question becomes, are those expenses part of the definition of adequacy? Because, not every school is going to have tennis courts and swimming pools. So how do you separate those costs that have been lumped into that cost equation from those things that are the base adequacy requirement? And I guess that's my question, because I don't see the two equal.
So one thing that we need to do there, Bruce, is make sure that we talk about it in terms of the opportunity for an adequate education.
Sure. I actually have a thought about that. Iris, though, has raised her hand, but
Okay. Mr.
You want me to speak or wait?
Please, Iris.
Okay, Val's put his finger on one thing that's still troubling me. whether the cost is the total cost of all current spending or it isn't for various reasons. But I'm also still a little cloudy on how we've defined adequacy. I mean, I guess I'm thinking about it as the opportunity to achieve the average outcome.
Yes,
I don't know if that's correct,
yes.
but well, then I'm still stuck on my question I raised Monday, which is how does that unfold over time in relation to how you've defined it? That's question number 2 I'm still stuck on. And number 1, going backwards, I guess. The number 1 thing I'm still stuck on, Drew's presentation on the regression analysis just didn't help me at all. I felt like if you already understood it, you thought it was great and succinct. But if you didn't understand it going in, I still didn't understand it. And so I'm left wondering, I understand starting with outcomes, and I understand this outcomes index that was created from the 3 pieces of data. And I think actually the index that created and the stats that came out of it were incredibly spot on, but in terms of where the needs are. But I don't understand still what the regression analysis does to that index data to create the weights that I now understand from Monday's meeting are really kind of inconsequential financially. You can say this weight's worth that and the other's worth the other, but as Drew said to me when I asked, it really doesn't matter because they're getting what they got from step 1. And if I don't understand step 1, I'm still stuck.
Yeah.
That's 3 reasons.
All right, let's see. So the way that the weights, let me try it this way. Our student count is a weighted count. So, right. And so that's how the count, the weights are carried forward, is in the number of students to be funded.
Yeah, I got that. But when I asked about, like whether we could take out the small schools thing if we decided it wasn't significant and use those funds to shift it to a greater weight for free and reduced, the answer is sure you can, but you really just move beans around. It doesn't make a difference because you still have the number of beans that was determined in step 1.
That's right.
And that was the first time I really realized that the weights had no consequence.
Well,
Which given that, I mean, I understand they're a way to express step 1's results, but they don't have a meaning in that you can't change funding based on changing those weights.
Well, the weights, yeah.
Jordan, I always like the way Jordan tries to tackle this.
Well, so my understanding of it is, so you have, as you say, the total amount of spending in the state is the total amount of spending in the state. And so they're saying that that's not going to change, the total dollars spent. But what the weights change is the distribution of that spending to particular districts based on the student characteristics in those districts. So because students are getting, so in Manchester, there are more students who have free and reduced lunch or who have ELL. They are getting, basically it's a way of distributing what you have as one pot of money that has led to average outcomes in the state. But you're saying that basically what the model is saying, that by distributing this, we can move from different outcomes in different places to a more uniform level of outcomes based on characteristics. And to determine that, that's where the weights come in, is they
But the amount of money they get is determined in step one. It's not
Yes.
determined in step one with two with the weights. The
Absolutely.
weights are simply an expression of the money that was determined in step one.
And it's Jordan, am I correct in saying that it's a zero-sum game? So if you want to give more money to,
Manchester.
special ed, then you're going to reduce the amount of money that's going to be available for the other two characteristics that we have, which is the free and reduced lunch and the English as a second language. So the total amount doesn't change, but the distribution would change if you change the weights. But the weights as they're currently calculated maintains the best fit formula that the regression analysis creates. So if you change the weights, you're going to effectively change the regression analysis, and you're going to tweak it one way or the other off the optimum point. And therefore your distributions to some districts are going to go up and other districts perhaps would go down, because you've now shifted the distribution of the fixed amount of money. And if you use the weights as they're currently calculated, you'll maintain the relationship that's best expressed by the regression. That's my understanding. Maybe it's wrong, but that's my understanding.
I think it's right. And my problem with describing step one as a single step, is that it really was 3 steps integrated together.
Right.
And
I don't know. Drew seemed to say that you don't change the distribution when you change the difference in weights.
No, you can definitely change the distribution. And the simulation model, Iris, shows that, where if you were to just completely change a weight, you could change the result in Manchester from 21 grand to, you could go to 18, or you could go to 25. 23. You could go above. So you can do that. But I think that, stepping back from it, what they came to the table and looked at is, what's the total spending in New Hampshire? 3 billion. How is that total spending split up and divided up among districts? And they saw it. And then they said, okay, let's get an attribute of that district, like free and reduced lunch. And does the spending, how does it relate? The current spending relate? And then they asked the big question, which was, if we think that the right attributes that should guide the division of the total pie among districts are a poverty measure like free and reduced lunch, what other way could we divine that would take that total pie and split it differently? And I think what they came up with was the step one approach, which says, using statistical methodologies, if we want to try and make it so that, let's make a prediction of what would be necessary to spend in every district based on its unique resources to achieve a target definition of outcome, which is the statewide average performance based on the data that's there. And that came up with, instead of Manchester spending 14,000 a pupil, which is what it's currently getting under whatever our current system is, it came out suggesting that Manchester should get 22,000 a pupil of the pie. And then the goal was to say, look, we can't write a regression formula into state statute. So let's figure out a linear approach that LBA could do. And what they did is say, if you pick these weights that are fit, you will end up producing an amount of total spending in Manchester that is very close to the prediction that was the pure method in step one. In other words, we're not going to put step one into statute. What we're going to put is the definition goal, which is to achieve common opportunities for common outcomes. But then we're going to put in statute a much simpler linear weighting. And Iris, I've done it myself. If I put ELL at 0 weight, I dramatically change the amount of dollars for Manchester, Nashua, and Concord. So that weighting in that simulation does have an effect. Now, if you were to say to me, is that a good thing? I'd say, I don't think so, because it moves the result dramatically away from the indicated predicted cost of step 1. And that is really what we paid the experts to do, which is say, show us what you think the pie should be divided like. That's how I'm reading it, Iris. You can really change the result if you change those weights, as Val said.
Well, then it makes me wish we had pursued getting rid of the small schools thing or making it somehow fiscally tested. Anyway, that's really helpful. I'm going to try and wrap my head around that. Thank you.
Well, and I'm sorry. I think this is, number one, let me just confirm, Iris. And I'm not a legislator, but I think explaining to a Bedford representative, so why am I getting 12,000 a pupil out of this?
Yeah.
And why is Manchester right across,
Right.
here getting 22? Jay, you are a legislator. You know that that's not an easy explanation.
I think you should forget about one then.
I mean, that's the real test, Jay.
Just don't mention step 1.
Well, yeah, I think you gotta, because that's the purity. As a matter of fact, let me just finish with this, Iris. I tend to look at it a little bit from the legal perspective. And I could expect, just like the Conval case, that some lawyer is going to say, hey, look at this formula is giving us a total spending target of 14,000, whereas other communities are getting 22. That's irrational. And now I am going to prove that it's irrational. And my proof is 14,000 is too different than 22,000. And what would happen is the legislature, if they were to adopt it, would then present evidence showing that the resulting predicted cost, 22 versus 14, is incredibly statistically sound. It makes sense. And you would put an expert, Drew, in front of a trial judge and say, so what's your expertise? What's your credibility? What were you trying to do? How did your step 1 come up with these relationships among communities? And the defense, the plaintiff's lawyers were going, oh boy, now we have to try and take apart the step 1, but it sure seems logical. So that's, unfortunately, this is where I see it, that it's really vital. Step 1 is the most important thing because it explains why there's a difference between Claremont and Hanover.
And let's be clear about step 1. Step 1 is not it's based on existing, it's a goodness of fit to the existing data.
Exactly.
Data that existed from 2019 backwards.
Yeah.
What step 2 does is it takes those weights that were developed on actual spending and uses it to in a predictive sense going forward. So you're right, Bill. It is there for budget writers to be able to define the factors, the differentiated needs of it for allocation.
Yeah.
Well, then I think you do need to find a way to explain it in layman's terms.
Yeah.
Which Drew didn't do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we can, why I think we can do that. And there are 2 things that drive me to that. One is it actually was the court hearing, Supreme Court hearing. And they asked, or the Attorney General's office asked, can you demonstrate harm from the existing formula? And, on an input-driven model, you really can't demonstrate harm. On an output-driven or student-centered output-driven model, we have the outcomes to demonstrate
The harm.
that there actually is some harm.
Yeah.
And then in districts, there are different outcomes, and we're trying to equalize the opportunity for an adequate education, and this model comes closer to it.
Yeah.
That's the first thought, which and now second one. Val, you had a point.
No, one of the things that's happening in industry now, and especially manufacturing, because you're going into this new world, which they're calling manufacturing 4.0, and it's greater emphasis on data-driven decision making. So this whole school model, spending model, is nothing more than what the world of manufacturing globally is doing, which is collecting data and then analyzing the data and using the data to drive your decisions, which removes a lot of the personal bias that exists so often in decision making, where everyone is grabbing their own particular perspective on things. By having information coming from the data, it doesn't lie and it doesn't have a bias in it. It tells you what is based on the use of tried and true statistical methods. So I think this is not that different than what the manufacturing world is going through right now. As we collect more data and have the ability to do that, people are making decisions quickly with these models that they create from the data that they collect. So it's not that unusual a set of circumstances or unusual a process, because it's happening everywhere in the world right now in manufacturing as we collect and analyze data.
Yeah.
Jay, follow up. I think Val is, so Val, I agree with you. However, if I'm going I'm going to jump to Iris's, what I think Iris has said, what she did with the team that she was on in 2008 was choose different data on which to develop the relationships among communities. And the data she chose was data like how much, what are the cost components that go in to a basic level of public education, teachers' costs, benefit costs, custodial costs, and added those up, and that came to the number that they got to. That is data-based. That input approach is based on data. Indeed, as we heard from the Massachusetts Representative Pesh, stop me from butchering her name because she was brilliant. What's her name? Alice
Pesh.
Pesh. She said Massachusetts calculates it on that data add up approach.
Right.
Now,
But
I think that emphasizes that is a very easy to understand approach. It's what superintendents use when they're building a budget. I get it. But the problem is with that approach is that could come up and say that, wow, Manchester actually costs less to provide, an education on an input cost basis than a small district like Hanover. Well, guess what? That's missing something. That is missing something. And the change that Jay and the team and AIR, Bruce, have brought to the table is a change that says what we're going to look at is how these districts are actually performing for their students. And in that context, we're going to say, this is what we think is necessary to spend in order to achieve an outcome target. And I think that means Hanover does not get the same amount per pupil as Manchester. That's the big thing.
In a state distribution. Let me continue with that, where I was going, because I remember if we can demonstrate what the definition of an opportunity for an adequate education is, based on the statistical differences that exist among students and districts because of their student characteristics, if we can demonstrate that, which I think the AIR study really gives us evidence base, as Val just said, then I think the structure for implementing it is not all that different from the report done in 2008. I guess so. I'll differ a little bit from just focusing on that input part of that set of recommendations, because they recommended all of the differentiated need categories that are the basis for the weights that are in the AIR perfect fit model. The only ones that are different are on school size and not weighting to a greater extent elementary pupils, and instead weighting middle school pupils. And we've got evidence to indicate that to us. But I think it's, Bill, you mentioned LBA, and so that, you know, this is where maybe we come from different places, but we start coming together around that LBA. You know, how does this get implemented? Because if we can make that case about, let's start from the differentiated needs, I think the categories are already existing in the statute. So it's
how we get there.
It's the weights that are
so important and different, Jay. It's vital in the legal world, because if you say, how did you get to the weights in the current law? The method of getting there is entirely different than the method that's being used by AIR.
Iris, you see a...
Well, we didn't do a regression analysis, but it's all based on trying to measure need through free and reduced and ELL and special ed. And in fact, it was trying to measure need through concentrations too, which I earlier yielded on that point to this group. But boy, I was shocked when Drew was going through his thing and Manchester was at 58% free and reduced. And I heard that concentrations were in the mass formula, but they're not significant in New Hampshire. Well, why isn't having 58% free and reduced significant anywhere? I don't get it. Yes, thank you, Jay. I mean, that was the whole point of the work in OA. It was to target money within the definition of adequacy to the extent possible. And the weights were expression of doing that. The same thing you're trying to do here.
Yeah.
You just derive it from a different place. But I guess I'm wondering, given Bill's explanation, what happens, and I'd asked Drew this and I didn't get what to me was any kind of meaningful response that I could understand, but I don't understand what happens over time. If you're defining the opportunity to achieve the average outcome as adequacy, as you give more money to districts that are having a hard time providing that opportunity, and you hopefully, you'll either see change or you won't. I don't understand how that affects A, the definition over time, and B, the distribution over time. You know, how do you avoid getting to a place where you're rewarding, not improving? That's a double negative, but I think you understand what I mean.
I think I do, yeah. But Bill, you're eager to respond.
I wanted to try it because I love the question.
Yeah.
I think that what happens is, first thing you do is determine the relationships among communities through the step one, and you make a prediction of cost. Second thing you do in the first year of our time period we're going to examine is you develop a set of weightings across cost factors and attribute factors that get you to fit that predicted cost set of relationships. Boom. And so in the first year, Iris, you enact into law something that says the definition of adequacy is statewide average performance. And then in terms of determining the value or cost of adequacy, we use these weights off of these ADM factors, and it gets you to this number. And until the legislature changes those weights, they shall remain in law. So the first year you do it, DOE says, here's your cost allocation, targeted cost, and here's how you calculate the grant. The next year, same thing. Next year, same thing. Now, let's assume that the legislature says, we got to see how we're doing. And so maybe, 5 years in, you hire AIR on a very limited basis, run your regression again against the performance definition, see what comes out. And then you see if your weighting is still right and you make adjustments. So in the current statute, with the formula you worked on back in 2008, it set a base number at 3709 or whatever, 35, right? And it set these other dollar figures, and those were actually baked into the law. And then they would carry forward until the legislature changed them again. So I think that the reality is you're setting the relationships in year one and then watching to make sure that you're not getting strange results. So the one factor that will change over that time dramatically is enrollment, including the number of students that are in each category. And that will change the grant level, but the weights themselves won't change until the legislature decides to change it. Jay, that's what, and Iris, that's what I think happens over time.
But if the average outcome goes up, well, first of all, spending overall is going to go up.
That's what the weights will do, Iris. We can't change the weights on an annual basis.
No.
But let's assume that actually we can move the needle, and the outcomes and the factor scores, instead of being 2-3 deviations away, standard deviation, they start to narrow, and we've got a much narrower band. That would be success, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And so that's why we would need to come back and change the weights, because if students who have free and reduced lunch characteristics, if their outcomes are more to the average of the state, well, that'd be great. And then the weight wouldn't be as significant. Same thing for special education and ELL.
Well, then you're losing money as you improve your performance.
No, we
Distribute it a different way.
distribute it differently. Yeah, because this is
Right. Well, to me, in my district, if my performance goes up, I lose money.
No, because it really is about to get you to the average. I don't think you lose money by going to 70% graduation rate. I'm sorry, 70% proficiency rate. You just don't gain any. Well, I guess you do in the model. That's not correct. You're correct. I'm incorrect. The amount needed to achieve those outcomes is less, but that's right. If there is that hypothetical district that has a 60% proficiency rate and they go to 70% with the same amount of resources, I guess predictably 5 years later, we might come back and that model might say it doesn't take as much to get to the state average. And that,
Yeah.
5 years later, though, when you run the analysis again.
yeah, I mean, you can't do it on an annual basis. You can't take a 1 year's blip because it's only going to be a third grade class, right? I mean, you got to be able to track those students through 3rd to 8th grade and in the high school. I mean, there's got to be a run up on this.
Yeah, I understand you need time, but it's still, even given that time, it's kind of perverse that if you improve your performance, you get less money going forward.
Well, in this distribution,
I honestly, on that, Iris, I've been on the other side of that argument where people say to me, you're so in favor of driving greater resources to Claremont. Yeah, but you're rewarding poor teaching and poor school systems. People have said that to me on that side of it. The other way is, at the end of the day, if performance improves in a place like Claremont, then you have to assess that performance against other districts again, every 5 years or every 10 years, whatever we all decide. And if in fact there's another town, say Berlin, that has not improved, it is not the wrong answer to have the state direct greater resources to that town who needs help hitting that goal at that time. And it's not a punishment to a town that has done a good job making changes with the resources that the state directed to it to try and improve performance. I mean, I think that that's how I don't know that it's right to say, you know, if you improve your performance, you get less money. It's not really that. It's you're getting more money to improve your performance. And if you do that, that's fantastic. And we're going to keep looking at everyone together to make sure where those resources are most needed.
Val, did you still want to make a point?
Yeah, just going back to Bill's earlier argument or discussion about the 2008 funding designations in the adequacy formula that gets you to your $3,500. And if you go forward to the Conval lawsuit, they didn't argue with any of those line items. What they argued was that they did not keep pace with the actual cost to provide them. So I think that's why we're in such a pickle, is $3,500 hasn't changed in 12 years. And all Conval said is that, hey, for us to do what the 2008 category said, it costs us $12,000 to do that today. And the state adequacy or state cost level is 17. So they're saying just to do what the state told us to do in the past, it costs us $11,000, $12,000. So therefore, if we keep that same relationship, the state is responsible for $12,000 out of the 17. That's pretty straightforward, and it doesn't change what was decided upon in 2008. All it's doing is updating the costs to what they really are. And that's reflected in the AIR number. It's saying it's $17,000. And the Conval argument is that based on the existing categories, it's 11 or 12. And they added about $800 worth of expenses from state mandatory requirements that the state did not fund. So food services, school nurse, superintendent, all those things were added into their adequacy costs because these were mandated expenses that were not funded by the state. So they're saying, hey, the state should be paying for these mandates. And when you add all that stuff up and you throw in transportation, it comes out to about $11,000. You know, that's to me, it's hard to argue with real numbers that they're coming up with on their cost side and the real numbers that we're coming up with in the AIR. The two things come together, and there is a pathway between the 2008 categories and the AIR report if you just, you know, allow things to follow through. At least that's my interpretation.
Jordan?
Yeah, I'm with you, Val. I was just going to say the same thing. When the wonderful work that actually was done in 2008, we cannot put aside.
That's correct.
To look at what you did in 2008 to get us to where we've been building on now. The money, of course, did not change. And a lot were added, as you know, to the list of things that we needed to provide in our schools. And 3,400 and something we started with, right, Iris? And then it went up to 35 and then 37. And here we are 12 years later at the 3704 or whatever. But if we look also, I just wanted to say I agree everything I was going to say Val said, except for one other thing. We're going to do this over a 5-year period, but I would hope and I anticipate that there will be monitoring of what this looks like over the 5-year period. We're not going to wait for 5 years or 12 years or whatever. We're really going to be watching how this unfolds and what this looks like. I think we've got some, you know, it may not be every district we look at. We certainly can look at a number. We have so many different, we have cooperative systems, we have regional systems, we have large schools, small schools, the whole thing. I've been superintendent in 2 very different systems. One was here in Keene, we had 6 districts under our SAU. That means 6 different budgets, 6 different boards, 32 contracts, you name it. Then I was superintendent up in Mascoma, where we had 5 towns and it was a regional. We have 1 board. We had weighted for the towns, a very different kind of system. We had 1 set of policies, 1 set of contracts for all of our schools, et cetera. So all of this gets taken into account when we start looking on a yearly basis. I worked in the 2 different systems during this time. I'll tell you, watching all the hard work in 2008, and then over all these years, how we've worked to make this fit in has been challenging. I think one of our goals is not to have this go past 5 years. We really need to take a good look at what we're doing. Who knows what tomorrow may be? Who would have thought COVID would come in? And that's, you know, we look at the quality of the air in our schools, which is a big issue now. When we talk about building aid, we've got a number, who would have thought about this a year ago? We didn't, but here we are. So
yeah, you know, one of the things, so Barbara, you raise a really good point, and it is about accountability. And accountability, we've noted, and Bruce, I think, you know, it's under our recommendations, the note about accountability, concerns going forward. And I know, I believe one of the recommendations that we're going to have is that there ought to be some type of committee, like a legislative committee or commission going forward. We can debate what the form of it is. It would be helpful for legislators to have the sense of, does it, you know, what is the form of it, not absolute composition. Because accountability is going to need to be assessed over time, right? Yeah, and it's going to take data. And we know that we've got 3 outcome variables now in the model, and that we've got these various categories in addition to our differential needs, all of which we have expectations that things will adjust as a result of this change in funding distribution, state funded distributions. And somebody's going to need to monitor the data and see whether it's 5 years or 7 years. Yeah, I mean, that's just going to need to be assessed. Jane, I saw you. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just support what Barbara was saying about the monitoring piece. I think one of the things that we've learned through our work is that there's very little statewide data, and this is going to be a real shift in thinking in terms of housing that data, and as Barbara said, monitoring it regularly. And that takes manpower, and it really will be a critical piece in this, because we know that some districts, as Barbara mentioned, change dramatically in 1 year, 2 years, and those districts who have, you know, continued change in leadership, kids moving in and out on a regular basis. I mean, just talking to Berlin this week, because of the cost of rents, they had, I think, over 50 kids move in since September. And of those, half of them were kids with IEPs. And so how is that information going to, you know, and if they're gone by the end of next year, so all of this will have to be part of the monitoring, and whoever does that, if it's the department, that's going to be a huge shift in not only thinking, but manpower and expertise.
So you're, Jane, just to be clear, that you're suggesting that moving to an outcomes-based model, that the staffing at the Department of Education isn't organized or sufficient to provide all of that information to measure and to assess. Is that?
That's my perspective. And Barbara, you've also been in the field in terms of the department's ability and manpower to get out and actually monitor what's happening in school districts. It's
Right.
tough now, and,
Right,
and
they-
it's just a paper review.
That hasn't
Right,
changed.
I'm right with you. One of the things that could change is the DOE. The 25, that format could change and give us more reliable data than what's included. That hasn't been done in a number of years. So that could change, and that would give us some of these statistics that we need. But particularly, as you say, Jane, you're right. We have 1 year, we can have such a switch and a change and within a district. It's amazing what can happen. And that needs to be captured. It really does. And it could be, if we looked at the DOE 25, if that could be changed in some way to include some of this information that you all are seeing we're not able to get.
All right, if we're going to get to that level of, I mean, so we have not done a tear down or critical review of the DOE 25.
I don't know that I heard Barbara and Jane saying that. I just think maybe a sentence that says, we've got to up our game on data collection and we direct a process that's going to do it. It's certainly not, I don't think it's within necessarily this commission's goal to redevelop the DOE 25.
I agree with that. It would be helpful to have an example or two.
The average teacher salary and turnover rate's probably going to be one of the key indicators.
Those are the two variables I wrote down based on our previous.
Right, and they're not collecting it now, but there's so much anecdotal information that tells you if the teachers are not stable in the school district, the kids don't do well. And the biggest thing there is salary. So I mean, it's pretty straightforward. If you're going to grab data, I think a lot of people would agree average teacher salary and turnover rate would be a good indication of accountability, because if more money is going to a district, but they're still turning over their teachers, you'd have to ask, what's that money being used for? Because, you know, if 70% of their costs are labor costs and they have a high turnover rate, they should be trying to stem that turnover rate by paying teachers a salary that they don't have to leave the district to make their lives, normal. So I think that's got to be at least a suggestion of data collection.
I think the staff, the overall staff turnover, I think it was the one I wrote down as I was listening to the conversation. As Doug Hall pointed out to us, average teacher salary actually is a part of the data collection the department is doing currently.
Right, but turnover rate wasn't. I think he also
Turnover's
said
not there, and it's a really good example of a statistic that could lead to correlations with other outcome data.
Yeah, data collection is important, but collecting the right data is the more important thing. And
Bill.
I just wanted to follow up on something Val said to just make sure, I may misunderstand something. Val, I heard you kind of equate the argument in Conval for the 10,000 with the AIR report and the number that they're suggesting, which is at the statewide average of like 19.5. I see that those are unbelievably different numbers. And the reason is that Conval case is about kind of the old definition of adequacy, which is a lower number that's supposed to relate to only the state finance piece, whereas AIR has said over and over again, their number is the total spend, which includes both the state finance, the state budget portion, the federal portion, and In their model, no, they took out federal, but in the local portion. That is a very important difference on, and that's the way I'm thinking of it.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you disagree with that, but
No, I do to some extent, because the Conval lawsuit took the existing definition of adequacy, all the teacher salaries and specialties and everything else, and said $3,700 doesn't cut it in 2020. If we use those same categories and update the cost to actually achieve all those things, it's $11,000, which to me is 2/3 of what AIR says the total cost is. So I think their argument is to achieve the adequacy and the state's obligation, it's $12,000, not $3,700. And that AIR says, yeah, and the total is this. So there's a difference between the 11,000 and the 17, which is, some sort of a non-adequacy based cost that, that has to do with running the school district.
this one, Jay, this gets to Jay.
I've had my.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'd be glad to take that on a little bit, but Iris,
On to Val's point, I too have wondered if we had simply done what the Conval folks had asked and increased the costs that went into that formula and then actually funded them. How different would that spreadsheet look? The AIR distribution. In other words,
it would be quite different. And here's why. The tweaks in the Conval challenge is that they changed the proportion of students to faculty in a classroom.
Yeah, I understand that, and that was one of the biggest.
I mean, that's huge. They changed it for the K through 2, and they changed it for every other grade after that.
There for that debate.
That makes quite a difference. And the second is that
But what I'm saying is the distribution. First of all, I think that Val's point that the number lands somewhere in a conceptual way, somewhere it makes sense in relation to what done. But what I'm saying is, if you took the new costs that they wanted to have incorporated, and you went back to the weights that were in the original legislation before it was butchered, and added back those costs in to raise the base, and then you created the spreadsheet based on those weights, would Berlin or Claremont or Manchester, proportionally to the rest of the world, how would that spreadsheet look relationally to the one we're working with here? And I don't understand why you say we so normally different, because the weights are in the, as you said, in the same places.
Yeah, the same needs.
Yeah.
We may very well, have done that, but we would not have added in the outcomes as the measure for determining that by district. And
yeah, I'm just curious how the two would compare in terms of who would get more and who would get less.
Right. And right.
Just a quick share. This is the existing legislation, and this is the Conval complaint. As you can see, they take little exception to a lot of it. Where their big differences are teachers, specialty costs, facilities, and transportation.
Yeah.
And then the ones in blue are the mandated services they need to apply that were not covered by money from the state.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the numbers right out of their complaint.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So to Iris's point, they haven't said restore the 2008 weightings. This thing would give Hanover the same amount of money per pupil as Claremont. That's what's wrong with our current system. Now, maybe Iris, the 2008 formula did a little better job, but this lawsuit is not advocating for a redistribution that focuses on the communities who are most in need. It's advocating for just jacking up the number for every community.
And so let me see if this might move us a little bit away from trying to line these, take these two different approaches and try and see if they actually align. Because I think one of the strengths of moving to the student-centered outcome-based model is that we are not stepping into the court case. We aren't trying to render the decision based on an input model. We are taking an outcome-based approach, which really emphasizes the differentiated needs of districts, which is the endpoint of where the 2008 model may have desired to go, but never got to. It's just, it is different. It's a different model. And I'm glad that people can see that potentially the outcome is comparable, but the means of getting there is quite different.
Right.
And then, Jay, the underlying this discussion is this concept of first and last dollar. You can hear it because Val, what you're talking about is, well, just, you know, $12,000, that's reasonable. It's not even close to the 19,000 that it actually is. So that, but if that comes with the state budget has to pay that whole 12 in every town, you're talking about a system that's running into a brick wall.
Yeah, or
And
that's,
I know we haven't, I don't know when we're going to deal with this issue, Jay, but to write a report that doesn't deal with it is to write nothing.
You mean the first and last dollar?
Yeah, and as Dick pointed out, he goes, the court has never said first and last dollar, but there are people who talk like that. And so I'm using that language. I honestly, the big issue is, Iris, as you know, that this woman was great in Massachusetts. She said, yeah, Wellesley gets $1,700 a pupil from the state, and New Bedford gets $16,000 from the state. That's the type of state aid distribution that makes a progressive formula. And I don't think any first and last dollar person who believes that the court has said that believes that you can give Hanover 1,700 and give Claremont or Manchester 16,000. I just don't, Jay, I don't know how we're going to address this, but it's standing there, bang, right in the middle of everything the commission is hoping to accomplish.
I think we'll, so if we think of the means by which this is going to be implemented and the phasing of how this phases in, I think that we can have a vision for that.
I'd like to hear
You-
the vision. And
so-
I know that the executive committee may have a thought on that,
Yeah.
but remember, there's every member of the commission is gonna, have it brought up at the end, is gonna get quite a disruptive process.
And I've asked that we do that exactly, Bill. So let's hope that we tee that up soon at a full commission meeting, because I think that's where that conversation needs to be had.
Agreed.
I think all the commissioners need to participate in that.
Absolutely.
How are we doing with that? Can we move past this conversation, Iris? I just want to.
Yeah, I can wait and do it at the full committee. I just wanted to, I appreciate Bill's passion, but I think there are still quite a few people who interpret the court's ruling that way. So let's just not stick them all in a bucket somewhere and
Iris, I'm not
disparage them.
disparaging.
You.
I'm
finish.
trying to bring it.
Let me finish. It's a valid point of view. And I think it needs to be acknowledged as such. That's all I'm saying.
Agreed.
Okay.
Agreed. And,
We'll
and
wait
Senator
until that conversation at a full commission meeting. That's fine.
All right. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So I think, Bruce, if we've got the outline of who's doing what, just so that we can, do you have that to put up?
You mean the categorical aid briefs?
Categorical and yeah, the differential aid and
Well, right now, the briefs that we've contracted out are around the categorical areas of building aid, CTE, special education aid, old language catastrophic aid, charter schools, and early childhood education.
right. So
And so those are at some level of getting started or underway. So we'll have those pieces done to address how our recommendations will take into consideration those categories and any recommendations we might have for fixing policy related to those. I think that what I've inferred from the conversation so far is that each of those areas is outside of what we've been calling base adequacy, which itself is a problematic term now, but it's outside of base adequacy and the differential components of free and reduced lunch, English language learning, and then the special education grants that are going out to schools at this point anyway. So that's underway. And I don't know, Jay, if you want to sort of commission some additional analyses within adequacy at this point.
I see. No, I had just questioned to Bruce that it seemed like through our categorical aid assignments, as opposed to contracts, that we were covering everything, but I think you've just summarized it well.
Yeah.
All of our differentiated needs are covered in the AIR study,
Right.
and the development of the weights around each of those differentiated needs.
Yeah, and those still sit within the adequacy work group, and in some way, I think we're at the adequacy work group, this group,
Yeah.
has at least provisionally agreed to move forward with the calculations created by AIR for their base amount and differentiated aid. And now the question before us is, how do we treat these other categorical grant areas in which districts receive grants for building, for career and tech ed, for special ed? The charter school is a little bit different because that's a grant that goes out to charter schools. That's a portion of the base adequacy amount. And then there's early childhood education, which Barbara and I are going to be working on starting later on today, I hope. And I will say that as I've listened to the conversation today, if we look at the policy questions document that I also included with today's
Yep.
agenda,
Yep.
we're touching on we're hitting on all of those, and nothing's come up that isn't represented by these questions, either that we've addressed so far or that we're currently addressing. There are a series of questions that we need to tackle. That is, we, meaning the adequacy work group. As I look at this document, what do we want to do about performance measures? What do we want to say about performance measures as benchmarks for future adjustments to the funding formula? Will we make any recommendations about the current way in which dollars flow out to public charters? Can we build a crosswalk and somehow, or at least help folks understand the relationship between the existing, we'll call it the 2008 input model, and the 2020 AIR student-centered model, to help our audiences understand what we're moving from to and how they're still connected. And with a lot of our conversation today and other times reminds us that these are connected. This is not creating something out of whole cloth. We still have inputs in our school budgets. And the inputs now are focused on what's needed to achieve that statewide average, not simply what's needed to run a school system. on a school district. And then what does all of this mean for all those other budget items that people really care about, like athletics, like transportation, like the quality of the technology in the school, what kind of training staff get, how to pay salaries to teachers so that they stay more than 1 year. So in any case, I think we're still operating, within the universe of what our key issues are. This issue of first and last dollar is a larger question that fiscal policy has to take up, and the full commission absolutely has to address. I think that Bill is right that we haven't landed yet on how the commission is thinking about first and last dollar, but we've certainly had the conversation. We've heard different interpretations of court decisions relative to first and last dollar. In my own mind, as I have heard the conversations, it seems to me the first and last dollar question is, what's the state's obligation? And I think of this as kind of a sliding scale, a continuum. Right now, the state's obligation has been interpreted to be about 13% of local per pupil expenditures. And we think that probably the courts and others have said that's not enough to even out the disparities across our districts. Is it going to be 100% state obligation like Vermont with a statewide property tax that then funds 100% of local school budgets? I don't think so, but it's going to be somewhere more than probably 13%. That's right now.
When you say 13, Bruce, are you referring to the Commerce Department data that says it's 32% state financing? What is your 13%? How did you get?
That's just a different measure. So right now, about 62% of local school budgets are retained locally. So it's all retained locally. This is the language challenge. Local property tax pays for about 62% of local school budgets. And then
The balance is
13% is what is called the statewide property tax, which is then, again, it stays locally, but it's accounted for at the state level. So it adds up to about 75%.
Well, okay, I see what you're saying. No, I'm in that group that says that's a state budget number. That's an appropriation through the state budget.
Yes, right. Yeah.
So it's actually like 32, whereas Mass is 38 state share.
Yeah, right. It's a different percentage of the base.
Yeah.
So Jay, that's my summary kind of where things we are right now. We've talked today about phase-in also, and I know fiscal policy today and earlier, and I wasn't able to be at that meeting. Some of you may have been. Fiscal policy was also talking about how we phase in any changes in fiscal policy. And I think the 5-year window is one that people seem to be generally comfortable with. In adequacy, our concern is how do we assess the impact of a new distribution formula on student performance over time? And we probably need a 5-year window to do that. I think in fiscal policy, it's if we're going to increase the state share, what's the source of that state share? Is it still something we call a statewide property tax? Do we change the mix from other revenue sources in the state? And I also, finally think that in general, we have an implicit assumption or provisional agreement in the commission that we're not talking about finding additional dollars to fund our public education system. We're talking about redistributing the dollars that currently exist, because right now we're achieving at a pretty good level of outcomes statewide. And then the question is, what does a school district need to get to that statewide average versus what's spent? And so, right now we have this $17,000 or $19,000 per pupil number in our heads. That's a reflection of local choice to spend money on athletics, building, administration, and so on. What's needed to achieve a statewide average is our concern of the opportunity to achieve an average outcome. And that's the base plus differentiated aid. Or targeted is another term I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, and it gets to that discussion that we've had about local control.
Absolutely.
That actually this model gives school districts that opportunity to just determine what their needs are of their students, what their capacity is, and how to allocate these dollars, as opposed to expecting that they have to be allocated based on input assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, when there's still the state regulations and standards that require certain kinds of.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's
Which includes, by the way, art and PE and music.
So there is local control built into this, but it's really that the local control has to do with what does a district or a community decide to spend above what's necessary to achieve statewide average. And that's fine. Hanover and Waterville Valley and Newcastle can all look at their students' achievements and decide, well, we also want to spend this additional money because we think that our kids deserve X, Y, and Z.
Isn't that money included in the 17,000 right now?
Yeah, in the statewide per pupil average, it is.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, but there's nothing about our recommendations that's going to determine what the local spending is going to be.
Right.
Right. That's right.
I'm gonna put just a hang up a parking lot check mark on that, Jay. I think if we were to go down a path like California, which would order that all of the financing of if $19,500 per pupil is the statewide average, if we set that at quote unquote constitutional adequacy and all of that had to be funded with state budget dollars, I think eliminating local control as two things: decision over content, method, and spending, and decision over taxing contribution. Those two things together create the engine of local vesting in quality public schools. If we were to somehow end up at a place where we were suggesting that the role of local taxation would be squashed to almost nothing, I think you're undermining local control significantly, because frankly, it's a siren call if someone says, no, we're going to keep local control, but it's all going to come from the state budget. Trust me, there won't be any strings attached. We all know better than that.
Yeah, I don't think we're suggesting that.
Yeah, I hope not.
No.
I hope not.
Certainly not in this work group.
No. Well, that's why I keep coming back to the question is, of that $19,000, how much of it is coming from the state and how much of it is coming from the local people? Because they need to have skin in the game if they're going to take any interest in their local educational system. If they don't have skin in the game, then, everything falls apart. So, but then, the extent of their interest, if they want to fund things beyond what's required for the the adequate education, that's up to them. And if they want to have 5 elementary schools instead of 3, that's their dollar. They can choose that. And if they want to send all their kids to Disney World on trips, that's their local control. They can do what they want. That has nothing to do with adequacy. To me, that's the sort of changes you see with the rich districts or in the poor districts. Some are going to be able to do the extra stuff, but hopefully all will have enough to make sure the kids come out of that school system with the education that they should have.
We also want to make sure we don't lose that list of requirements, because if you don't have such things in there as art and music and PE and computer science and all, they'll be gone.
Yep.
We need to make sure they are requirements of our state for our children. So
Yeah,
I want to protect that 193 and probably add to it, but
right. Well, I think the Conval argument is to achieve all of those requirements requires the $11,000. That's what they're saying. And how that's distributed, I mean, that's an average number, just like 19,000 is an average number, and how you distribute it is something else. But I think their argument is to get to that adequate levels is going to cost about that much money. And if you have a district that can't afford that, then that's where the state's focus should be.
Well, that's the difficulty, is in distinguishing between spending by choice and the fiscal capacity to spend what's needed. And how do you distinguish between the two?
Yeah, but I think it depends on how much of that adequacy cost is provided by the state, because if it's enough that the local fiscal capacity is not going to influence that, then the local capacity can fund what they want to fund. But if the adequacy part of it is what the state supports, then that's a different situation.
Right, but as we know that what we say, 70%, can't
Yep.
remember my school board days. 70% of cost is salary.
Yep.
Yeah, so the amount that's discretionary is very small. And that's why I think it's really hard to find that balance between knowing what is discretionary and what is the inability to have fiscal capacity.
Well, you got some school districts that only hire teachers with less than 5 years, experience to keep the cost down. So that is their decision of, how they wish to, express their,
Well, that's what they can afford in many ways.
right. Well, that's what we're trying to get past this. They should have
I
a
know.
teacher, that they,
So where's that line?
Yeah.
Right.
And so I do think that we do need to address accountability in our report.
Yes.
Because if we do a 5-year analysis with annual monitoring and District X, which is underfunded, and a new formula provides additional dollars, and there's no change in student outcomes with the additional dollars, there has to be some accountability and some mechanism for holding those districts accountable so that they do whatever the problem is, pay their teachers more, provide more professional development, upgrade their lab equipment, whatever that. Those are all inputs. We're not throwing.
That's
inputs
right.
out.
That's exactly right, Bruce. That's what I was trying to say earlier, that monitoring and the accountability aspect. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
But
And
if they're not improving, it could also mean they need more resources.
Maybe the formula is not enough. That's true.
Yeah. I mean, with 58% free and reduced, giving Manchester $20,000, whatever, is going to help. But I don't think it's going to solve all their problems.
No, I agree. And that's a bigger issue that.
Yeah.
that
So if you don't improve,
can't solve the problem of poverty. I mean, that's.
It also, but it also, no, it doesn't. But it also, it requires more money raised locally,
right.
as well, because that the tax cap that's there. I mean,
yeah, what do you do about tax cap
well,
community?
that's their policy, but the impact is that the additional spending that the outcomes-based model suggests isn't all derived from state or the general pool that we currently have. There's a lot to be done with local input, revenue input. Yeah, I mean, it shows up in the simulator, and I'm sure others have seen that by looking to see the impact.
I think, Jay, by you raising local control, which gets into this, it gets immediately into the discussion round that we just had. Bruce was saying there's a 13% number, there's a 100% number. It's not going to be either extreme. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. Val started talking about they got to have skin in the game for local property taxation. Iris says very correctly, boy, that's a tough line to find. What do you do with a community that puts a tax cap on that cripples the local financing? I think all those issues all are dancing around the core question. What will the role be for local property taxation in whatever model gets set? How significant will it be? In Vermont, it's a little lower. They've converted a lot of it to state. In Massachusetts, it's, you know, it's significant. It's 60% local property tax. And in New Hampshire, obviously it's significant. What is our recommendation going to be on the proper mix?
Well,
And
some people would say, why not other revenue sources?
exactly right.
It's gonna, whatever it is, it'll be aspirational, right?
Yeah.
Well, we seem to be
Because the
twisting.
model needs to work under whatever that answer is.
Correct.
Right. Yeah, the nice thing about the simulation model is that you can pick any source of revenue you want and throw it in there and still, get the output that you're looking for. So whether, you have a statewide property tax or a statewide income tax or whatever you want to do to raise the equivalent amount of money, each, with their own set of circumstances and complaints and criticisms, it doesn't matter what the mix is as long as it comes up with the amount. So there is a lot of room for creativity about how the money is raised.
Yes. Yep. Folks, have we reached a conclusion for our meeting of today?
Conclusion's a pretty big term, Jay.
Have we spent sufficient time on the topics that we had on our agenda? We clearly need to come back together with some things more definitively written out so that we can tweak it, we can bring it to the full commission, we can reach some agreement on some core principles for the committee. And
I think it feels to me like that is our the stage we're getting to now is we need to put some things down in writing for people to respond to, at least, provisional draft kind of stuff, because I think we're going to start going in circles a bit. And I think we've probably come to more, at least implicit understandings than we might be giving ourselves credit for. And by putting things down in writing, that will also clarify what we're not yet ready to put down in writing. So I think that Monday's full commission meeting, and we have another one, we'll have 3 in a row here. We had one this week, have another one Monday, another one the following Monday, will give us as a full commission a chance to begin to put a stake in the ground. And, as I've noted, by November 9th, couple of 3 weeks out, we need to begin to have a draft, at least at the work group level, to take to the full commission at its November, whatever the next meeting is after that. In other words, by mid-November, we need to have a commission draft in order to meet our December 1.
And so to set our expectations for our next meeting, which is going to be a week from today, is that we ought to be able to circulate probably by the close of Tuesday drafts on each of these categorical aid topics so that we can, we've made a recommendation on using a student-centered outcome-based model, and we've got that wording. We've made a recommendation on transportation being in the model. We have our differentiated need categories pretty well defined in our AIR report. So these categorical aid areas do constitute some other principles that we might wish to provide the basis for why those principles are important for the committee to make a statement on. And that's where I think that is our topic for the next meeting is on each of those categorical aid. Are there some principles that we want to reach to, and have we put enough information together to enable the commission to make those suggestions?
Jay, at the risk of making Bruce turn his face all crazy, it would be nice if someone like Bruce and his team were to try drafting the language about the step 1, step 2 issue that we've discussed today so that we can see it on paper. I think we had a good discussion you know, I still think our understandings are still kind of shimmering and not a full meeting of the minds. But I think we're at the point where it'd be very helpful to see some paragraphs on describing what the AIR process is and what its outcome and how it gets to the weightings and to see whether people agree with that.
Mhm.
I don't want you to punch me, Bruce, for saying that, but I
No,
think
it's
No,
I think
somebody
we're
has
there.
to take
now or
a
never.
stab at putting that regression analysis into layman's terms. Yeah,
Important narrative.
yeah.
Yes. Bruce, you accept?
Yeah, oh, I know that's sure. That's the work that has to be done. What the timing of it is, sometime over the next week, we have to begin to do that. Put pen to paper.
So let's hope that we can get to that in the next week. And
And
we all,
Jay, I'm
yeah.
working on the property tax relief mechanisms a
Yeah.
little bit now but I will get done with that. And if Bruce needs a staffer to help on some of this, I'll try and circle back.
Thank you, Bill. I'm taking
I'm
notes.
just letting down the adequacy group on the categorical aid programs. I'm sorry, I'm not avoiding the work. I've been deployed on something.
Yeah. No,
Yeah, that's
absolutely.
good.
Sorry about that.
We
Plenty to do.
were keeping you in the bullpen for that.
Good choice.
That absolutely. Game 3 scoring. Okay. Good for today.
Yeah, Barbara.